Weaken world missions. One critical consequence of our first two anti-intellectual trends is the combined effect of weakening world missions. I once attended a meeting of missionaries from around the world at which a national Christian leader from Central America stood up and passionately exhorted North American mission agencies to stop sending evangelists to his country because their efforts were producing Marxists bent on overthrowing the government. You could have heard a pin drop in the meeting, and confusion was written on everyone's face. This leader went on to explain that the leading Christian thinkers in his country held to liberation theology, a form of Marxism draped in religious garb. Evangelical missionaries would lead people to Christ, but the liberals were attracting the thinking leaders among the converts and training them in Marxist ideology, which these liberals identified as the true center of the biblical theology. The leader pleaded with North Americans to send more theologians and Bible teachers and to help set up more seminaries and training centers in this country because the need for intellectual leadership was great. And you wondered where the Sandistas came from. For some time, theological liberals have understood that whoever controls the thinking leadership of the church and a culture will eventually control the church itself. Recently, I met a man from Fiji who was won to Christ by an evangelical missionary and who, subsequent to conversion, wanted to come to the United States for seminary training. Unfortunately, there was no money for this sort of intellectual development in the evangelical mission strategies there, but theological liberals gave him a scholarship to study at a liberal seminary in Texas. By the time I met him, he had given up his faith and was going back to Fiji with an extremely secular view of Christianity. His mission, to pastor a church. If evangelicals placed more value on the mind, we would give more to developing intellectual leadership around the world. Happily, some good things are now being done in this area, but we need to intensify our efforts in this regard, and this will happen only if we evangelicals come to value more fully Christ's admonitions to be good stewards of the intellectual life. Unfortunately, there remain two more deadly trends that have affected the church because of anti-intellectualism. Number 4, anti-intellectualism has spawned an irrelevant gospel. Today we share the gospel primarily as a means of addressing felt needs. We give testimonies of changed lives and say to people that if they want to become better parents or overcome depression or loneliness, then Christ is the answer for them. As true as this may be, such an approach to evangelicalism is inadequate for two reasons. First, it does not reach people who may be out of touch with their feelings. Consequently, if men in our culture are in general less in touch with their feelings than women, this approach will not reach men effectively. Second, it invites the response, sorry, but I don't have a need. Have you ever wondered why no one responded to the Apostle Paul in this manner? If you look at his evangelistic approach in Acts 17 through 20, the answer becomes obvious. He based his preaching on the fact that the gospel is true and reasonable to believe. He reasoned with and tried to persuade people intelligently to accept Christ. Now, if the gospel is true and reasonable to believe, then it is obvious that every person has a need for Christ's forgiveness and power, whether or not that person feels that need. The only response to the Pauline evangelistic approach is either to accept Christ or deny the truth of the gospel. The person approached is not let off the hook simply because he is out of touch with his feelings or doesn't recognize the felt need. The fact that many respond to our evangelistic efforts by denying a need for Christ should tip us off to an important fact. If truth and reasonableness are not uppermost in our presentation of the gospel to a pagan culture already predisposed to regarding religion as a set of private feelings, then we'll consistently hear this response. Well, that's fine for you if having those feelings helps you. Religion is now viewed by many as a placebo or emotional crutch, precisely because that is how we often pitch the gospel to unbelievers. I wish I could stop here, but again, there's another trend in evangelicalism that we must place at the feet of anti-intellectualism. Number 5, a loss of boldness in confronting the idea structures in our culture with effective Christian witness. Now this is a mouthful, but anti-intellectualism has drained the church of its boldness in witnessing and speaking out about important issues in places where ideas are generated. And for those who do not have such courage, anti-intellectualism has created a context in which we Christians often come off as shallow, defensive, and reactionary instead of thoughtful, confident, and articulate. One evening, a couple came to our home for dinner. During the meal, the husband said almost nothing except "pass the chicken." Despite repeated attempts to engage him, the conversation took place primarily among the two wives and me. However, as dessert was being served, the topic of conversation turned to motorboats, and from that point on, we could hardly get a word in edgewise. Why? Boats were the man's hobby. He owned 2 of them, knew how to build one from scratch, and truly was an expert on the subject. He had courage to speak up because he knew what he was talking about. He did not need to be defensive when someone differed with his viewpoint because he was confident about his knowledge. I have trained people to share their faith for over 26 years. I can tell you from experience that when people learn what they believe and why, they become bold in their witness and attractive in the way they engage others in debate or dialogue. While pastoring a church in Baltimore, I once taught a 12-week class on Christian apologetics. The course cost $50 to take, required 2 textbooks, and had several homework assignments, including 2 papers. When the 6th week ended, a man named Bob came up to me after class with tears running down his cheeks, expressed his gratitude for high academic standards and requirements in the class. I asked him why he was grateful about this. I will never forget this response. He told me he had worked at the same place for 10 years, but had never shared his faith with anyone because he was afraid someone would ask him a question, but he would not know the answer, and his inadequate preparation would embarrass him and the Christian faith. But at his workplace the week before this particular class, he had shared his faith with 3 workers because for the first time he felt that he had some answers, and his boldness was strengthened by that conviction. Being a Christian is no different from caring about boats in this regard. There's nothing magic about being confident, articulate, or bold in either area. Knowing what you're talking about may be hard work, but it clearly pays off. Anti-intellectualism has not merely impacted the lives of believers within the bosom of Christ, it has serious repercussions in the culture at large. As anti-intellectualism has softened our impact for Christ, so too has it contributed to secularization of culture. If the salt loses its saltiness, the meat will be impacted. In the aftermath of the Scopes trial in 1925, conservative Christianity was largely dismissed as an embarrassment among intellectual and cultural movers and shakers. As a result, we now live in one of the most secular cultures in history.